Hey everyone, so we covered the strongest state a while back. I thought it was time to finally look at the weakest state of every character. Let's get into it. Trapper is a weird case where I think he was kind of strongest and weakest at the same point, depending on how you look at it. His release state had a lot of drawbacks. There were perks such as Slippery Meat and Small Game that directly countered your power. There was also the ability for survivors to completely remove traps from the game by sabotaging them. Your general set speed was also slower. Despite these many drawbacks, he still received a bunch of nerfs early on, so I think somewhere during that first year. Wraith being an early days character means he was released in a very poor state, and was debatably the weakest of the original three for quite a while. He had a number of drawbacks in his original state, and very few upsides. One of the biggest downsides, I think, was Wraith's lack of ability to do actions when he was cloaked, like he couldn't open lockers or break pallets. He lacked general stealth, had slower cloaking and uncloaking, his bell would sound sooner, and Lightburn took just 1 second to activate. He was really weak back then. Billy was weakest directly after the nerf to his chainsaw, where they added the overheat mechanic, and completely gutted a bunch of his add-ons, where prior he was one of the better characters in the game. Overheat originally was more punishing, it would build faster, and it would also increase quicker if you tapped the power a lot. The add-ons he received in this patch were also really terrible. Even though he benefited from gaining iridescent add-ons, they still kind of sucked. Funnily enough, Nurse's weakest state is probably how she is today, with her being nerfed fairly substantially over the years. I guess we could say just prior to the current day, between 6.5.0, where she received her nerf to special attacks, and before the removal of Lightburn in 6.7.0, which was a small buff. Myers is probably the weakest in his current state also. He was actually considered one of the stronger characters back upon release and in the early days. Nowadays he's just very average comparatively to others. He has a few add-ons that make him more viable, like his tombstone piece, but that's really not an indication of the overall character being strong. Hag was weakest after her release. She was very slow and clunky, and many of her add-ons were really terrible and would directly nerf her. Her traps would take very long to set, she had a smaller teleport range of just 32 meters, when you teleported you'd have to suffer a small cooldown where you couldn't move. There was also general quality of life issues, like survivors being able to trigger traps in the dying state. Doctor was weaker prior to his rework. If you didn't know, before Doctor was unable to attack when in his power and using his shock. He had to switch between attack mode and shock mode. He also didn't have his big AoE shock like he does now. The alternate thing he had was a static field surrounding him that would put survivors into madness whenever they were close. This power upon release was buffed extensively, and even after all of that, it still needed a rework. It was pretty bad. Huntress is a tough one because she hasn't really had much happen to her. I would say the main thing indicating her power is probably her change in add-ons. Therefore, I'd say her weakest state was probably just after her nerf to her iridescent head in 4.7.0. She also received a nerf to things like her venomous concoction in that patch, which previously allowed her to apply a 90-second duration of exhaustion. All of this was changed in this add-on pass. Bubba, I would say, was upon release. The main downside of Bubba back then was simply that he had very little going for him. His power used to not have charges, and so had a shorter duration, but the same tantrum downsides. He also shared add-ons with Billy, and so many of the add-ons just didn't apply well to his power. The chainsaw and how you charged it was also just kind of awkward to use. He basically wasn't touched for a long time too, so anywhere pretty much up to that big rework. Freddy is a character with lots of weak instances and also strong instances, but ultimately I think he was weakest with his original power. The power worked differently and would require you to manually pull each survivor into the dream world. Awake survivors wouldn't take damage when you hit them. Freddy also had nothing else. His power was the ability to let you damage survivors. He also had a bunch of pretty terrible add-ons, and many downsides to his already bad power, like being slowed down for using it. Pig was actually considered pretty decent upon release. It was only after a bunch of largely unnecessary seeming nerfs that the whole nerf Pig meme started. She had her terror radius moved from 28 meters to 32, her traps would only activate on generator completion instead of the beginning of the endgame collapse also, and inactive traps wouldn't trigger any longer when exiting through the gates. Her ambush got nerfed to no longer count as a basic attack too. Her carry speed was even nerfed. I would debate somewhere between September 2019 to around October 2021 is when she was weakest. Clown was for sure a little weaker prior to his add-on passes and power rework, probably just his release version to be honest. He used to not have yellow bottles, and a big downside was that he'd become slowed when readying a bottle, which felt quite clunky. Clown otherwise hasn't changed much. Spirit is a tough one. I'd maybe make a case for now. I've also heard she was fairly weak in the early days. She had a longer 20-second power charge time. Survivors originally could hear her phasing when close by, and her breathing and footsteps were louder during phase. There were definite upsides for her back then, such as having collision in phase, but these were also debatably survivor buffs too, so I think I'll go with them. Legion is a pretty tough one. Release Legion wasn't actually the best, they were just quite annoying, with how they could chase one person and down them without any counterplay essentially. I do think however that due to the harshness of this strategy, I would lean more toward the weaker state being just after their rework, when they received a long string of nerfs, and were not yet buffed to their current day state, and also had a bunch of useless add-ons. Plague's main drawback prior to her current day version was probably how she originally didn't spawn with a red pool. This often meant survivors would just never cleanse, and disallow you from ever getting your other power. This wasn't actually her weakest though. Her weakest was probably her release version. She only remained in her pre-buff version for about 2 weeks, but it's still worth touching on. She had a shorter corrupt purge and was slower when charging it. Infection used to reset whenever you hook someone, and infection lasted just 20 seconds when infecting objects. She also later got a bunch of add-on buffs. Ghostface was probably his PTB or release version. I think it's fairly well known that Ghostface's early Night Shroud was very bad, because the detection seemed to be quite buggy. He had a much longer recovery time for his power at 30 seconds compared to the current 20, and a shorter mark duration of 45 seconds. Demogorgon was also probably weakest upon its release, just prior to its very early change in 3.2.1, when it became able to break pallets with Shred. I would say that's the most significant change it had to its power, and prior to its round of buffs before it got removed. Oni, I would say, is closer to being weaker nowadays, with his PTB version actually being very strong. Prior, he had no cap to the angle at which you could turn when slamming with your smash attack. It would allow crazy things like 180-degree flicks. Oni realistically hasn't been changed much since then, so debatably it's just from then to now, shockingly. Deathslinger is also probably nowadays, despite him being quite strong. He received a sizable nerf in October 2021, when his ADS speed was nerfed significantly, and the need to fully aim in before you could shoot. He also couldn't aim out as fast either. A big one, and I would debate the most damaging nerf, was his terror radius being nerfed from 24 meters to 32 meters, making him far less sneaky. Executioner is a similar case of being a little too strong initially, and so being nerfed down. His current state is probably his weakest, which is saying something considering he isn't weak currently. Pyramid Head originally had a much stronger ranged attack, able to instantly cancel it, allowing him to take control of windows very easily. He was able to easily camp cages as he could both see them and stand close to them, this being even harder to do in a recent patch, which make it so if you stand within 10 meters of a cage, they get moved. Blight's weakest state was likely his release state, with him having lots of collision issues, and also having a much lower POV, which was later changed to more closely match his actual in-game height. He also couldn't initially break pallets or walls with his rushes, a bit like original demo. Maybe the one benefit he had back then was some debatably stronger add-ons. Twins were the worst in the very early days, debatably as far back as the PTB. I remember this PTB well because it was the buggiest piece of DBD content that has ever been created. I distinctly remember a trial where Victor became trapped within the floor, and he couldn't move. One of the main issues with early days twins was that survivors could completely rob you of your power, and did so simply by stealing Victor. Once a survivor had Victor attached, there was no timer like there is today, where he gets released and respawned. He just stayed there. Survivor teams therefore would just have one guy take Victor, and then as twins you had no power. Another big issue was you could completely avoid Victor by jumping into a locker. This was later remedied by allowing Victor to trap survivors in lockers, but it's still a pretty huge oversight. There was also general issues like very long cooldowns and clunkiness. Trickster suffered greatly in his early days, with requiring 8 lacerations to cause damage instead of the current 6. he was far slower when throwing blades, and would get as slow as 2.68 meters per second, which was considerably slower than Survivors. The other big downside was Main Event, which would have just a 10-second activation window, making it often completely useless. Most of these issues were changed after a short 2-week period, but this is still his weakest state nonetheless. Nemesis has really not been changed much. I would probably say his release version, and prior to the small buff he got to his tentacle. In the PTB there were some debatable greater strengths, such as a shorter respawn time for zombies, but they were also buffed in some ways after too, so debatable. Cenobite I would probably say is weakest nowadays. He no longer benefits from perks like Franklin's Demise. He's had a bunch of add-on nerfs, such as to Engineer's Fang too. Artist was probably weakest post her PTB nerfs, but was a little weaker prior to the buff she got, where survivors could no longer flash like crows. Artist in her PTB had some really strong abilities, like being able to damage survivors with idle crows, which allowed her to shut down loops incredibly effectively. Sadako has had very few iterations, debatably there being just 2 real instances of change, which are both her release version and the recent rework she's had. I would opt for her weakest of these being her release version. She had a number of issues with this version, the main one being the ineffectiveness of her condemned mechanic, and the pointlessness of the tapes. You would largely rely on using your teleport and stealth, otherwise Sadako was pretty weak without her iridescent videotape add-on. Dredge was undoubtedly its PTB version, where Nightfall was not particularly dark, and actually very easy for survivors to see through. It hasn't really been changed at all otherwise, so I would say then. Wesker was probably weakest upon release too, and largely because his collision felt a little off. He would often move past survivors he should have grabbed. Knight upon release was actually quite weak, and it took a few patches before he became stronger. The guards were wholly weaker, they did less damage to generators, they were more easily visible when Knight drew a path, as you could see exactly where it was going. The guards took longer to spawn, and stuff like that. Original Knight was really bad and really boring, and they managed to buff him up with things like the bonus haste effects and such, to make him pretty decent nowadays. Skull Merchant is kind of tough to judge, whether she was stronger or weaker before. I think I would largely lean into saying that she is stronger nowadays, with her haste effect and things like ultrasonic trap speaker being incorporated into her base kit. She was good at 3-genning upon release, but not much else. Now she's somewhat good at chase, and 3-genning. Singularity was definitely weakest during his PTB, where EMPs were extremely strong and able to knock his power very easily. PTB Singularity was really bad in my opinion. Debatably one of the weakest instances of a killer in the game maybe ever. There were 7 total supply crates within the trial, EMPs charged slightly faster, survivors could see the boxes always, and this basically meant that there was no short supply of EMPs, meaning even mid-chase you could quickly retrieve one and just remove poor Hux's power. Alien is too hard to tell currently. It greatly depends on whether it receives largely nerfs or buffs before its release. I guess we'll see. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you have any thoughts or additions to my assessments on the weakest states down below. Thanks, and goodbye.